The county hearing room had 48 chairs, and Cedar Vale had managed to fill 53 of them. 5 residents stood along the back wall. 2 more waited in the hallway. At the front table, Elaine Porter had arranged 3 binders in a straight line, each one labeled in white block letters: access, history, and emergency. She had also brought the HOA attorney, the property manager, and the expression of a person who believed organization was the same thing as evidence. I sat across from them with one inspection report, a folder of photographs, and a paper cup of county coffee that tasted as if it had also been placed under a load test. Elaine leaned toward the microphone. For 11 days, Mr. Mercer has obstructed the primary bridge serving 186 homes. We are asking the county to order him to remove his unauthorized weight restriction and restore normal access immediately. Normal access, in this case, meant delivery trucks, concrete mixers, landscaping rigs, moving vans, and anything else Cedar Vale had sent across a bridge nobody in the room could prove had been inspected recently. The county public works director, Raymond Cole, looked at me. "Mr. Mercer, did you close the bridge?" "No. Passenger vehicles are crossing now. Emergency access is coordinated. I restricted heavy vehicles after a licensed engineer said she could not verify the bridge for those loads." Elaine opened the access binder. "That is his interpretation." I slid the report forward. "It is the engineer's signature." Raymond read the first page, then turned to Elaine. "Do you have the current bridge inspection certificate?" The room went quiet, except for the small, optimistic clicking of binder rings. Elaine's property manager searched history. The attorney checked emergency. Elaine checked access twice, as though the right document might become embarrassed and reveal itself. It did not. That was the first moment the hearing stopped being about why I would not open the bridge. It became about why the HOA had been demanding that I do it. To explain how we reached that table, I have to go back 11 weeks, to the day I bought a ranch for injured horses and inherited a bridge problem nobody had bothered to name. I spent 22 years investigating structural losses for insurance carriers, property owners, and occasionally attorneys who preferred nouns like event because failure made people nervous. After a storm, fire, partial collapse, or expensive crack appeared where an expensive crack should not be, I was usually one of the people sent to determine what had happened before everyone involved developed a more convenient memory. I was not a structural engineer. That distinction matters. I knew how to preserve a scene, trace maintenance history, compare damage patterns, and recognize when a licensed specialist needed to take over. My professional skill was not having every answer. It was noticing which unanswered question could become dangerous. By 54, I wanted work that ended with something healing instead of a conference call about depreciation. My late wife, Anna, had volunteered with an equine rescue outside Tulsa. She could stand beside a neglected horse for an hour without asking anything from it, which was a talent she did not extend to insurance executives. After she died, I kept donating to the rescue, then helping with repairs, then spending weekends there. Eventually, I decided to build a rehabilitation center of my own. The Mercer Ranch was 2,300 acres of pasture, timber, creek bottom, and high meadow in western Colorado. The old owner had run cattle, but maintained only a small herd during his final years. The barns needed work. The south pasture needed fencing. One equipment shed had acquired a lien that several real estate photographs had described as rustic character. The land itself was sound. There was room for recovery paddocks, a veterinary bay, quarantine stalls, and quiet trails where horses could regain strength without a highway running beside them. Along the eastern boundary sat Cedar Vale, a gated residential development, built in phases beginning about 23 years earlier. Its main paved road crossed Cedar Creek on a short 2-lane bridge, climbed past the ranch boundary, and entered the subdivision through stone pillars tall enough to suggest the Romans had once approved the landscaping plan. The bridge was used constantly. Residents crossed it. Delivery trucks crossed it. Contractors crossed it. I assumed there was an easement and a maintenance arrangement somewhere in the closing records. On a property that size, assumptions are not ideal, but neither is reading 4 banker boxes before you own a chair. 3 days after closing, Cedar Vale sent me a welcome package. The first page said the HOA was delighted to welcome me into the Cedar Vale community. The next 3 pages carefully explained that my ranch was outside the association boundary and therefore ineligible for community amenities, voting privileges, trash collection, snow removal, pool access, and the December luminary contest. I had owned the ranch for 72 hours and had already been welcomed out of the community with impressive precision. The packet was signed by Elaine Porter, board president. Elaine was a commercial real estate broker in her late 40s. She was polished, efficient, and practiced at speaking in complete paragraphs. When we met a week later, she arrived in a white SUV, shook my hand, and told me Cedar Vale valued positive neighboring relationships. Then she gave me a list of requested landscaping standards for the ranch edge. "These are not enforceable against you," she said, smiling. "But visual continuity benefits everyone." I looked past her at 2,300 acres of grass, cottonwood, and mountain shadow. "I'll tell the elk there's a pallet." She paused long enough to decide whether I was joking. That became the basic rhythm of our relationship. Elaine delivered an official position. I checked whether it had a foundation. Usually, it had at least some. The ranch and Cedar Vale shared drainage, wildlife movement, wildfire concerns, and a road corridor. Cooperation made sense. For the first 3 weeks, I had no reason to think the bridge would become the center of anything. I was busy meeting contractors, clearing the veterinary bay, and repairing fencing. A nonprofit partner planned to transfer the first 6 horses in October. My construction schedule was tight. Every week mattered, but for the first time in years, the pressure felt useful. Then a landscaping truck crossed Cedar Creek while I was standing 20 yards from the near abutment, and the ground under my boots changed its rhythm. The truck carried pallets of decorative stone. I knew that because the load sat above the side rails and each pallet was wrapped in clear plastic, as if several tons of rock required protection from the outdoors. As it entered the bridge, I felt a low vibration through the creek bank. Vibration alone does not prove a structure is unsafe. Bridges move. They are designed to respond to load. But this was followed by a sharp report near the expansion joint and a visible shiver along the outside railing. The driver continued uphill without slowing. I walked to the edge of the approach. A diagonal crack ran from the pavement edge toward the concrete wing wall. The surface near it had settled slightly. Below, recent rain had cut away soil around part of the near abutment, exposing aggregate and leaving a narrow hollow where compacted fill should have been. I did not crawl under the bridge or announce an emergency. I took photographs from safe ground, noted the time and weather, and placed 2 small removable chalk marks at the ends of the visible crack. Then, I measured the distance between them. The next morning, the crack had not changed. 2 days later, a septic service truck crossed. I watched from the same location. The deck movement was visible this time, followed by another hard sound at the joint. A small amount of loose material dropped near the eroded edge. That was enough to stop observing casually. I emailed Elaine and asked for the most recent bridge inspection, posted load rating, maintenance schedule, and contact information for whoever managed the structure. Her response arrived in 24 minutes. The bridge has served Cedar Vale without incident for more than 2 decades. It is insured and maintained as needed. Please direct any future traffic concerns to the management office. Attached were the HOA's general liability certificate and an invoice from a landscaping company that had cleared brush near the creek the previous spring. Both documents looked official. Neither answered a question I had asked. An insurance certificate proves someone bought insurance. It does not prove concrete has developed self-confidence. I replied politely and repeated the request. Elaine called instead. Daniel, I think we may be allowing your professional background to make this more complicated than it is. My professional background is why I'm asking for the inspection instead of guessing. There has never been a structural problem. Then the report should be reassuring. She exhaled. I'm told our records are complete. Good. Who told you? There was a brief silence. Our property manager. Can he send the report? I'll have him look into it. The report did not arrive. The following Monday, I hired Priya Shah, a licensed structural engineer whose firm evaluated small bridges and rural infrastructure. I sent her my photographs, but not my conclusions. That was another habit from loss work. If you want an independent opinion, do not mail someone a completed opinion and ask them to autograph it. Priya visited on Wednesday. She spent 2 hours documenting the deck, joints, rail connections, visible bearing areas, drainage, abutments, and creek conditions. She used binoculars, gauges, and a camera on an extension pole. She asked about traffic types and weather history. At the end, she stood beside her truck and removed her safety vest. I'm not calling this an imminent collapse, she said. I am saying I cannot support unrestricted heavy loading based on what is visible and the records you have. What do you recommend? Temporary heavy vehicle restriction, controlled passenger use, emergency coordination, then a closer inspection, material review, and scour evaluation. That was not dramatic. It was cautious, specific, and inconvenient. In my experience, those are 3 features shared by most responsible safety recommendations. Priya sent a signed preliminary recommendation the next afternoon. I forwarded it to Elaine, the property manager, County Public Works, and the sheriff's non-emergency contact. I proposed a temporary limit, excluding heavy commercial vehicles, until the bridge could be evaluated. Passenger cars could continue. School transportation could continue under the county's direction. Fire, ambulance, and law enforcement access would be coordinated immediately. Smaller deliveries could cross. Heavy trucks could use an older service approach from the north after the HOA reopened and graded it, or schedule transfers to lighter vehicles. The alternate route added 12 minutes and required Cedar Vale to unlock a maintenance gate it had not used in years. It was not ideal. It was also better than testing an uncertain bridge with somebody's concrete mixer. I hired a traffic control contractor to install professional signs and movable barriers. Nothing was chained. Nothing blocked cars. The signs read, "Temporary load restriction, passenger vehicles only," and provided a contact number. Before installation, I called the county again and documented the conversation. At 4 that afternoon, Elaine arrived with the property manager and a printed memo. "You do not have authority to regulate Cedar Vale traffic," she said. "I have an engineer telling me not to allow heavy loading across a structure partly connected to my property. Until we establish who owns what, I'm acting narrowly." The HOA has maintained continuous access for 23 years. Access and load are not the same question. She handed me the memo. Its subject line was unauthorized private traffic policy. It was an impressive phrase. It contained 4 words, 3 implications, and no reference to the bridge. "Remove the signs by tomorrow morning," she said. "Send me the current inspection, and I'll give it to Priya today." We are not required to justify our use of our community bridge to an outside landowner. Then why is your community bridge touching my land? That question irritated her more than I expected. The bridge predates your purchase. So do the mountains. I'm still checking the records. The property manager looked down, possibly to hide a reaction. Elaine did not. The next morning, residents began calling. Most were annoyed, not hostile. A furniture delivery had been rescheduled. A roofing company refused the alternate route. One caller accused me of trying to collect tolls, an idea I had not considered and immediately rejected. Then Marcus Hale called. Marcus lived with his father, who used home oxygen and received regular medical supplies. He was not interested in HOA politics. He wanted to know whether the delivery van could cross. I asked for the vehicle weight and schedule. It was a standard cargo van, well below the temporary threshold Priya had recommended. "It can cross," I said. "I'll meet the driver if there's any confusion." Elaine told us all commercial deliveries were blocked. They aren't. I emailed him the written plan and copied the board. The delivery crossed the next day. I stood near the sign, waved the driver through, and watched Marcus's father receive his supplies. That detail mattered later. At the time, it simply seemed like the responsible thing to do. Elaine's revised memo arrived that evening. It acknowledged limited exceptions granted at Mr. Mercer's discretion, making a published engineering threshold sound like I was choosing who deserved oxygen. I read it twice, saved it, and began a new folder. That was when the bridge issue stopped being a maintenance question and became a documentation project. Elaine came back 3 days later with the HOA attorney, Martin Keene. Martin was courteous. That made the conversation more serious, not less. He asked to see Priya's letter, the signs, my closing survey, and the traffic plan. I showed him the first 3 and explained that I had ordered a boundary survey because the closing exhibit was too general around the creek. He listened, then said, "Cedar Vale's position is that it possesses established access rights sufficient for ordinary community use." Does ordinary use include unlimited truckloads on an unverified bridge? The bridge has historically carried commercial traffic. That tells me what happened yesterday. I'm asking what it is rated to carry tomorrow. Elaine stepped in. "This restriction is damaging property values and disrupting essential services. Then help me get the inspection done. Remove the restriction first." It was the kind of negotiation where one side asks you to discard the reason for negotiating. Martin handed me a letter titled "Final Opportunity for Voluntary Cooperation." It gave me 48 hours to restore unrestricted access or face injunctive action and damages. The phrase, "voluntary cooperation," had the emotional warmth of a parking boot. I sent everything to Lena Ortiz, a property and construction attorney I had worked with on 2 prior claims. She read the letter, Priya's recommendation, my purchase documents, and the HOA correspondence. "Do not broaden the restriction," she said. "Do not threaten closure. Keep emergency coordination in writing. And stop speaking to their attorney without me." That last one sounded personal. It is professional experience wearing comfortable shoes. The HOA filed in district court the following Monday. Its complaint alleged intentional interference with established access, private nuisance, and irreparable harm. It requested an emergency injunction ordering me to remove the signs and barriers. The filing included declarations from residents whose deliveries had been delayed, photographs of the signs, a 20-year history of community access, and a map showing the bridge and Cedar Vale Road. The map ended just before the ranch parcel line. Online, the story became simpler. New ranch owner blocks Cedar Vale Bridge. A local community page described me as an out-of-state investor, although I had lived in Colorado for 14 years. Someone posted that I planned to charge residents $500 a month. Someone else improved the rumor to $500 per crossing, which would at least have reduced traffic quickly. I did not respond online. Instead, I lost the excavation contractor scheduled to begin the rehabilitation barn drainage system. His insurer would not let heavy equipment cross while access was disputed. The next opening on his calendar was 7 weeks away. Then, our largest prospective donor called. "Daniel, is the property inaccessible?" she asked. "No. Passenger access is open. Heavy construction access needs a different route. Will this delay the horses?" Probably. There was no useful way to decorate that answer. For the first time, I wondered whether I had moved too fast. Priya had recommended the restriction, but I had implemented it on property I had owned for less than a month. Cedar Vale had used the bridge for decades. Judges do not always reward the newest person in a dispute for being the most certain. Lena did not offer reassurance. She offered categories. "We need to separate 5 questions," she said. "Who has access? Where is the bridge? Who owns it? Who maintains it? And what load is safe right now?" The HOA wants those to sound like one question, because history helps them on access. What helps us? Facts we do not have yet. That answer was less comforting than confidence, and much more useful. Owen Beck completed the boundary survey 6 days later. He met Lena and me near the creek with a field tablet, old plats, and the patient manner of someone accustomed to explaining that a line on a map does not move because a committee dislikes its location. The center line of Cedar Creek was not the parcel boundary. The recorded boundary followed an older meets and bounds description tied to monuments above the bank. The bridge's near abutment, wing wall, and roughly 32 feet of approach sat on my ranch. The far abutment and road continued onto land later dedicated to Cedar Vale. The bridge was not wholly mine, or wholly theirs, in any simple physical sense. That was good news for neither side, and excellent news for accuracy. "Does this let me stop access?" I asked. Lena shook her head. "Not automatically, and that is not our position. It establishes that they cannot treat you as a stranger interfering with a structure entirely under their control." Owen enlarged the survey. "Their lawsuit exhibit crops the base parcel here. If they used the developer's marketing plan instead of the recorded plat, they may not have noticed." "The map was attached to a sworn declaration," Lena said. "Then someone swore very confidently about the wrong picture. Priya's preliminary report arrived the same day. It did not say the bridge was about to collapse. It documented diagonal cracking at the approach, deterioration around a joint, possible bearing movement requiring closer access, erosion, and potential scour concern near the abutment, and the absence of a current load evaluation in the materials provided. Her conclusion was careful. Maintain the temporary heavy vehicle restriction until a detailed inspection and record review could establish capacity and necessary repairs. Martin Keene called Lena after receiving the survey and report. He no longer described the restriction as imaginary. He described it as disproportionate. The HOA offered to allow a visual inspection after the bridge reopened to normal traffic. Priya's written response was 1 paragraph. Unrestricted heavy loading should not resume before the inspection intended to determine whether unrestricted heavy loading was appropriate. It was difficult to improve on that sentence. The court declined to order immediate removal of the restriction without a hearing, but set an expedited schedule. The county, now aware of the location and condition questions, asked for the original bridge permit and maintenance records. Elaine sent residents a message saying the HOA remained fully confident in the historic integrity and continuous availability of Cedar Vale's access infrastructure. Historic integrity was not an engineering category I had encountered. It sounded sturdy, though. At that stage, we had 3 useful facts. Part of the bridge was on my land. A licensed engineer would not certify heavy loading. And the HOA's own court map omitted the property line that explained my involvement. We still did not know who had formally accepted responsibility for the bridge after the developer left. The answer should have been in the permanent records. As we soon learned, permanent described the binders more accurately than the records. The original bridge permit was stored in the county archive under the developer's first corporate name, Mountain Crest Holdings, not Cedar Vale. That distinction cost us 2 days and 1 conversation with an archivist named Gail, who had worked for the county since fax machines were considered modern infrastructure. Gail found the permit by searching the creek crossing number rather than the subdivision name. She rolled a set of scanned plans across a large monitor and pointed to a note in the approval conditions. Inspection after construction, every 24 months thereafter, and after significant flood or impact event, she read. Maintenance documentation retained by responsible owner or successor entity. Lena leaned closer. Is there a successor acceptance form? There should be. There was an initial completion inspection. There were 2 biennial reports from the developer years. There was a repair invoice after a flood 12 years earlier. Then the county file thinned out. The most recent inspection we could locate was 7 years old. It recommended sealing deck cracks, monitoring settlement near the approach, and improving drainage around the near abutment. The report did not impose a load restriction. It also did not authorize 7 more years of optimism. The developer had transferred roads, common areas, and several amenities to Cedar Vale in stages. We found a deed for the clubhouse parcel, a bill of sale covering gates and pool equipment, and an assignment of certain access rights. The bridge appeared on an asset schedule, but the schedule referred to an acceptance resolution we could not locate in the county file or the HOA production. Another document granted access across the creek corridor while reserving maintenance allocation for a later agreement. That later agreement was also missing. This did not mean nobody had access. It meant the legal history had answered permission to cross more clearly than responsibility for the structure carrying the crossing. Those are different questions, although HOAs prefer questions that can share a binder tab. Under expedited discovery, Cedar Vale produced its permanent records. I reviewed them with Lena and her paralegal in a conference room. The first binder contained governing documents. The second contained board resolutions. The third, labeled Capital Assets, Permanent, contained 7 copies of a warranty for pool furniture, 3 irrigation maps, a gate motor manual in French, and photographs from a clubhouse repainting project. It did not contain a current bridge inspection. The chairs are covered until 2034, I said. Lena kept turning pages. Try driving those across the creek. Martin argued that Cedar Vale's continuous maintenance, snow removal, patching, striping, brush clearing, demonstrated practical responsibility and supported uninterrupted use. Lena did not dispute that the HOA had performed work. Surface maintenance does not establish that required structural inspections occurred, she said. And historic access does not answer current load capacity. The distinction began to matter outside the lawsuit. County Public Works issued an interim notice endorsing controlled passenger and emergency use, but directing that heavy commercial loads remain restricted pending inspection. Elaine told residents the county had temporarily adopted Mr. Mercer's position out of an abundance of caution. That was one way to describe it. Another was that an engineer had identified warning conditions. The inspection was years out of date, and nobody could find the document assigning responsibility for either problem. Still, the missing handoff did not prove Elaine or the current board knew the bridge had deteriorated. It could have been inherited administrative disorder. Developments accumulate records the way barns accumulate mismatched hinges. Then Lena's paralegal found an invoice from a consulting firm dated 18 months earlier. The invoice referenced a Cedar Creek Crossing Condition Memorandum. The memorandum itself was not included. Martin initially said the memorandum could not be located. Lena requested the consultant's engagement file, payment approval, related emails, and meeting minutes from the same quarter. 3 days later, Cedar Vale supplemented its production. The condition memorandum was 6 pages long. It had been prepared after a resident reported a rough transition at the near approach. The consultant observed surface cracking, drainage erosion, and possible movement that could not be evaluated fully during the limited visit. The memorandum recommended a detailed structural inspection and review of load capacity before the next cycle of planned capital work. It did not say the bridge was unsafe. It did not predict collapse. It did say more investigation was warranted. That distinction was important. We were not going to turn a cautious memo into a prophecy simply because exaggeration would help us. The board's problem was not that it ignored a declaration of catastrophe. Its problem was that it received a professional recommendation to investigate and decided uncertainty was cheaper if left unnamed. The emails made that choice visible. The treasurer had asked whether a detailed inspection could trigger a special assessment. Elaine replied that opening a major structural review before the spring sales season could create unnecessary concern. Another board member suggested monitoring the approach and revisiting the issue during the next reserve study. Ruth Calder, then the board secretary, wrote, "Monitoring is not the same as inspection. We need a qualified load review before we keep sending construction trucks across." The final meeting summary said only, "Board discussed bridge condition and agreed to monitor as needed." The board had not lost the recommendation. It had translated it into a dialect where verbs no longer required action. Ruth had resigned from the board 6 months later. Lena interviewed her with both attorneys present. Ruth was a retired school administrator, direct without being dramatic. She confirmed that the memorandum had been circulated to the full board. She remembered asking that the inspection be added to the capital plan. "What was the response?" Lena asked. "That we needed more information before spending money on more information." Even Martin looked down at that. "Did President Porter say the bridge was safe?" "She said there was no evidence it was unsafe." "Did anyone explain that the recommended inspection was how the board would obtain that evidence?" "Several times." Elaine's concern about assessments was not invented. Cedar Vale had recently increased dues for wildfire mitigation and replaced 2 gate systems. Another large expense would anger residents. Some homeowners were preparing to sell. A structural investigation could create disclosure questions before it produced answers. Those pressures explained the decision. They did not make it responsible. When Elaine learned Ruth would testify, she sent a community update accusing me of using obsolete internal discussion to interfere with established access. Marcus forwarded it to me with one question. Was the report really 18 months ago? I sent him the memorandum, the county notice, and the interim access plan. He called 10 minutes later. My father's supplies can still get through? Yes. Ambulances, under the coordinated plan, yes. If county or fire officials change that, we follow them. Then why are we being told you closed the bridge? You should ask the person telling you. I could have said more. I wanted to say more. By then, the lawsuit had delayed the center, cost thousands, and turned a safety restriction into a neighborhood loyalty test. But anger is not improved by adding recipients. The residents still needed a bridge. They had not written the incomplete handoff or softened the meeting minutes. If I wanted the county to believe my position was about safe loading rather than bargaining power, I had to behave that way when it was inconvenient. That test arrived at the next community meeting. The Cedar Vale clubhouse was designed to make ordinary meetings look like minor diplomatic summits. It had a stone fireplace, a vaulted ceiling, and acoustic panels that did nothing to prevent people from interrupting each other. Lena advised me not to attend. Then the county asked both sides to present interim access proposals before the emergency hearing, and the HOA scheduled an open meeting. I went with Priya. Elaine began by describing the restriction as a threat to health, commerce, and community continuity. Those concerns were not imaginary. A heating fuel truck had been rerouted. 2 remodeling projects were delayed. A family moving into Cedar Vale had to transfer furniture to smaller vehicles. Residents worried about winter. Then Elaine said I had exempted my own ranch construction from the rules. That part was false. I stood when public comment opened. My excavation contractor lost his scheduled start because his equipment cannot cross the bridge. I am using the same limit for the ranch. The rehabilitation center is delayed at least 7 weeks. Someone near the back asked. Then why not remove the limit for everyone? Priya answered. Because equal exposure is not the same as acceptable risk. She explained the interim categories in plain language. Passenger vehicles could continue. Emergency vehicles would follow the plan coordinated with the county and fire district. Lighter deliveries could cross within the provisional threshold. Heavy trucks would use the north service route after grading or wait for the full inspection and any necessary stabilization. A resident named Laura Kim asked who would pay to reopen the north route. Elaine said Daniel should. I said, I will contribute to temporary work proportional to ranch use if the agreement preserves the ownership and maintenance questions. I will not sign a document saying the HOA owns a bridge when its own records do not establish that. That answer satisfied nobody completely, which is often evidence that a temporary plan is approaching fairness. Marcus stood near the end of the meeting. My father gets oxygen supplies, he said. I called Mr. Mercer the first week. The van crossed. He gave me the county contact and the written limits. I'm angry about the situation, but he did not block us. The room changed slightly, not dramatically. Nobody gasped. Elaine did not turn pale. Real meetings rarely provide stage directions. But residents began asking different questions. When was the last inspection? Who had the earlier memorandum? Why had the board described all commercial access as blocked? Was the north route included in emergency planning? What exactly had dues paid for under bridge maintenance? Elaine promised answers in writing. Afterward, she approached me by the fireplace. You are creating panic with incomplete information, she said quietly. I restricted heavy trucks because the information was incomplete. You know this could cost the association hundreds of thousands of dollars. I know. That is why the inspection should have happened 18 months ago. For once, she did not respond with a complete paragraph. The county approved grading the north service route for temporary heavy deliveries. Cedar Vale paid most of the cost. I paid a share tied to my construction use without waiving any claim. That decision hurt. The center budget was already strained. It also gave us the strongest fact we could carry into the hearing. I had accepted the same inconvenience, delay, and cost I was asking Cedar Vale to accept. Safety rules become suspicious when the person announcing them quietly exempts himself. Mine did not. That brought us back to the hearing room, Elaine's 3 binders, and the missing current certificate. The county had authority over the permit and emergency access coordination, while the district court controlled the injunction case. Raymond Cole made that distinction at the beginning. "We are not deciding permanent ownership today," he said. "We are deciding what use can continue safely while inspection and responsibility are resolved." Martin presented first. He emphasized 23 years of uninterrupted access, the burden on residents, winter conditions, and the absence of any declared structural emergency. He was careful not to promise the bridge was safe. He argued that Daniel had acted without county authorization when he first installed the restriction. That was his strongest point. Lena did not pretend otherwise. Mr. Mercer acted after receiving a licensed engineer's recommendation and notified the county, the HOA, and emergency contacts. The question now is not whether the first sign preceded a county notice by 48 hours. The question is whether unrestricted heavy loading should resume despite the facts now in the record. Priya testified first. She displayed photographs of the cracking, approach settlement, joint condition, and erosion. She explained what she could observe and what required closer access, testing, and calculations. Elaine's attorney asked, "Can you state, to a reasonable engineering certainty, that this bridge will fail under the next heavy truck?" "No." Several residents shifted. Then, Priya continued, "I also cannot state that it can safely carry unrestricted heavy vehicles under current conditions. The missing load documentation and observed deterioration are why further inspection is required." Martin asked whether the 18-month-old memorandum declared the bridge unsafe. It did not. So the board was not told the bridge was failing. The board was told conditions warranted a detailed structural review. Not receiving the answer is not evidence of a favorable answer when the recommended evaluation was never completed. That was the technical center of the case, and it landed without drama. Owen testified next. He showed the recorded parcel description and survey. The near abutment, wing wall, and part of the approach were on my ranch. He compared his survey with the HOA's lawsuit map. Raymond asked why the property line was absent from the HOA exhibit. Martin said the exhibit was intended to illustrate access, not ownership. "It illustrated Mr. Mercer out of the picture," Lena said. Raymond allowed himself half a smile and moved on. Gail from the county archive authenticated the original permit and inspection conditions. She identified the early reports, the 7-year-old report, and the absence of more recent certificates in the county file. Elaine said Cedar Vale had performed maintenance continuously. "What maintenance?" Raymond asked. "Snow removal, patching, striping, vegetation management. Structural inspection?" Elaine looked toward the property manager. He looked toward history. History remained loyal to the pool furniture. Lena introduced the developer turnover documents. She did not argue that Cedar Vale had no access. She showed that the bridge appeared on one asset schedule, that the referenced acceptance resolution was missing, and that an access assignment reserved maintenance allocation for a later agreement nobody had produced. "The ambiguity is not a weapon," she said. "It is a problem that should have been resolved before either party demanded unilateral control." Then Ruth Calder took the microphone. She identified the consultant memorandum and the board emails. She explained her request for a load review and the decision to postpone it. Elaine's attorney asked whether Elaine had ever said she wanted residents endangered. "Of course not," Ruth said. "Did the memorandum order closure? No. Did it impose a load restriction? No. It recommended the inspection that would tell us whether we needed one." Ruth had spent 30 years managing schools. She knew how to return a question with the unnecessary decoration removed. Elaine finally addressed the prior emails herself. "We had recently increased dues for wildfire mitigation. We were concerned about imposing another assessment based on a preliminary observation. We intended to monitor the bridge and include it in future planning. I believed that part. Elaine had not hoped for a failure. She had hoped the cost could wait until the uncertainty became someone else's agenda item. Raymond asked, "What monitoring protocol did the board adopt?" Elaine glanced at the minutes. "As needed." Who determined when it was needed? No one answered. The final evidence was the interim plan. Marcus confirmed his father's deliveries continued. The fire district confirmed coordinated access. The county confirmed the north route could support diverted heavy vehicles after grading. I provided my contractor cancellation and payment toward the alternate route. "You applied the restriction to your own construction?" Raymond asked. "Yes." "At what cost?" 7 weeks so far, plus the route contribution and remobilization. Elaine looked at me then. Until that moment, I do not think she had understood the delay was real for both sides. The county recessed for 40 minutes. When the panel returned, Raymond read the interim determination. Passenger vehicles could continue under posted controls. Emergency access would remain governed by the coordinated plan. Heavy commercial loading would remain restricted until a detailed inspection, load evaluation, and any required repairs were completed. The parties were directed to preserve records and submit a joint maintenance and access proposal. The county would not endorse unrestricted reopening. Elaine's emergency filing had successfully produced an emergency review. It just had not reviewed me. 2 days after the county decision, Martin called Lena and proposed mediation. The HOA did not dismiss the injunction immediately. Lawyers rarely remove a ladder before confirming where the floor is. But the county record had changed the case. Cedar Vale could no longer argue that my restriction lacked any official support. Discovery had also created a second risk. Continuing the lawsuit would require Elaine and other board members to explain the prior memorandum in greater detail. Within 3 weeks, the HOA withdrew its request for emergency injunctive relief. The remaining claims moved into settlement. The full inspection found that the bridge was repairable. The deck and primary members did not require replacement, but the approach settlement, drainage, bearing area, and scour protection required work. Heavy loads remained restricted during repair and until a revised load evaluation was complete. The cost was significant, but it was not the financial extinction some residents had feared. Mediation took 2 long days. The first day was mostly devoted to deciding who had been wrong in what order. The second was devoted to deciding what had to happen next, which was more productive. The final agreement did 5 things. First, Cedar Vale reimbursed my reasonable engineering and legal costs associated with the injunction and emergency process. I did not recover every dollar, but enough to restore the rehabilitation center's operating reserve. Second, the HOA funded the majority of the bridge repair tied to its historic community use, while I contributed a defined share for ranch access under the new arrangement. Third, the parties recorded an easement specifying passenger, emergency, service, and heavy vehicle access. The agreement did not pretend every vehicle imposed the same burden. Fourth, a maintenance covenant assigned inspection intervals, cost allocation, notice procedures, records custody, flood event review, and authority for temporary restrictions. Future boards would not need to search pool warranties to learn who called the engineer. Fifth, neither side could alter load conditions without written technical support and notice, except during a genuine emergency. Elaine resigned as president before the annual meeting. The official announcement said she wanted to focus on her business and family. I had no reason to challenge it. Cedar Vale elected a new board that included Marcus and Laura Kim. Their first infrastructure update was 4 pages long, attached the inspection schedule, identified the responsible engineer, and contained no phrase resembling monitor as needed. It was not exciting. That was the point. Repairs began in late summer. For several weeks, the bridge looked worse, because responsible repair has the public relations disadvantage of exposing the things irresponsible delay keeps covered. The eroded approach was rebuilt. Drainage was corrected. Joint and bearing work was completed. Cracks were evaluated and treated according to the engineer's design. Scour protection was installed, where the creek had removed support material. When the work was finished, PREA reviewed the testing and final documentation. The county accepted the report and approved reopening under posted limits. No one lost access to a home. No bridge fell into Cedar Creek. No one emerged with a secret deed proving they owned the entire neighborhood. We ended with something less spectacular and more useful: a safe crossing, a repair bill assigned in writing, and records the next board could actually find. The first 6 horses arrived in November, 7 weeks later than planned. One was a gray mare named Willow, who had spent months recovering from neglect. She refused to enter the new rehabilitation barn until Anna's old volunteer jacket was draped over the gate. I know that sounds sentimental. It was also the only method that worked. By then, the bridge had passed its required inspection and reopened to scheduled heavy traffic under the new limits. A feed truck crossed one morning while I stood near the south paddock. It moved slowly, exactly as posted, then continued toward the ranch without a rattle, argument, or emergency board email. Marcus later told me Cedar Vale meetings had become shorter. "People keep asking for attachments," he said. "That will do it." Elaine and I spoke once after her resignation. We met near the repaired approach, while county crews completed final drainage work. "I still think you could have handled the first week differently," she said. "I probably could have." She seemed surprised. "I also think the board should have ordered the inspection 18 months earlier," I said. "Probably." That was as close to agreement as we reached, and it was enough. Structures usually warn people before they fail. A crack changes. Water removes soil. A joint begins making a sound it did not make before. The warning does not always tell you the answer. It tells you to stop pretending you do not have a question. Organizations warn you too. They just have a greater talent for renaming the warning until it fits comfortably in the minutes. The rehabilitation center opened before winter. On quiet afternoons, the horses moved along the interior trail above Cedar Creek. From there, I could see the repaired bridge through the cottonwoods, carrying the weight it had been inspected to carry, and no longer depending on anyone's confidence alone. I had bought the ranch to build a place where damaged animals could recover safely. It turned out the first thing we rehabilitated was the way an entire community crossed the creek. If you have ever watched a confident demand collapse under one missing inspection, tell me about it in the comments.